Okay, is everybody seeing my screen? So my screen, I have two screens. My presentation's over here, so I probably will be looking over here, not at the camera, so I apologize for that. But yeah, so I wanted to get started sort of talking about like my background, you know, as more on the physical science side of things. So I tend to work on projects and things that are related to stream flow and precipitation, soil moisture, temperature, snowpack, even stuff like wind and humidity and all these sort of variables that I think if I asked you to define, especially this group, you know, any one of these, it would be very clear. We probably wouldn't have a long debate on what precipitation is or what temperature is. And this is sort of, you know, the background that I'm coming from. But along the way, I've found that, you know, where things get more interesting is sort of on the social science side of things, and that's where we start to get into these other types of words like sustainability and sensitivity and vulnerability and adaptive capacity and resiliency and so on and so forth. And if I were to ask you all to define one of these terms, we might have a good, healthy debate as to what they mean, right? And I think that's part of the fun and also part of the challenge in working in the world of sort of sustainability is first trying to get everybody speaking the same language and understanding the terminology that we're using. So today we're talking about vulnerability and specifically, at least I'm going to be focused on climate and climate change vulnerability. But I think for the most part, you know, the stuff we're talking about could be translated to other topics as well. So I'll take a stab at defining vulnerability. So I would say it's the extent to which a species, a person, habitat, ecosystem, watershed, or place, or anything else that you could think of is susceptible to the impacts of a negative event or a stressor or something of that sort. So if I asked you to measure it, even with this definition, do you think you could measure it? I probably couldn't. I think we need more, you know, to understand what vulnerability really is. And so, you know, when we're talking about trying to quantify vulnerability, I think now we start to get into some different frameworks for understanding vulnerability in different ways. And I'm familiar with at least two different frameworks that define vulnerability differently. I'm quite certain there are probably others as well, but the two that I'm most familiar with are the one from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. And that's where this kind of Venn diagram comes from, where they really define vulnerability as a function of risk. So what they're really trying to do is understand risk, and vulnerability is a component of risk. They define vulnerability as really having two components, that is sensitivity and adaptive capacity. And they define vulnerability as the likelihood of a negative impact. Then the second framework, which is the one that that I'm more familiar with, and the one that I've used the most, is defining vulnerability on its own, rather within the concept of risk. And in this case, we define it as a combination of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Exposure being the occurrence and magnitude of an event. So, you know, what is that? Well, okay, so right off the bat, you see here, we have the same definition. Exposure is the occurrence and magnitude of an event. But if you look up at the IPCC definition, they define hazard as the occurrence and magnitude of an event. So right away, we sort of have this weird conflicting idea of what these words mean. So what I would say is the key point to all of this is that we need to be very clear about our definitions and the frameworks that we're all working within. I don't think we'll get to the bottom of which one is right or wrong, but I think if we're going to have a conversation, it's important to be really clear what we're talking about. And so in this case, from here moving forward, I'll be talking about vulnerability on its own as a combination of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And we'll talk about what each one of those mean, or at least how I'm defining those. And we'll stay away from hazards and risks and leave that for the IPCC in another conversation. So exposure, in the terms of climate change, the way I like to think about it is this is, how much and what kind of climatic change are we talking about? So it could be flooding, it could be drought, it could be wildfires, it could be any number of these sort of events that we may be impacted by. So it's usually a magnitude and a likelihood of the event itself occurring. Sensitivity, that second component, I like to describe this as, how sensitive is the landscape or species to that change or that exposure that we mentioned before. So an example, or one way to think about this in terms of human sensitivity is this may be related to health impacts, right? If we're talking about, let's say, wildfire smoke, exposure would be, how much wildfire do we expect, or how much wildfire do we get now, and how much do we expect in the future? Sensitivity may be related to, do you have any sort of pulmonary disease that may exacerbate that exposure or that impact? And then finally, adaptive capacity, which is the ability of the landscape or the species to cope with these changes. So, even if maybe you have a health, something that makes you more sensitive, you may also have the ability to adapt to that sensitivity. And that's what we call adaptive capacity. So this is where my one slide where I share some equations. So for those of you who don't like equations, I apologize, but I think we're getting at sort of the way that, we can actually define and get at these terms. So really the main equation that I'm using is that vulnerability is some function F of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And that function, you could imagine maybe it's exposure plus sensitivity minus adaptive capacity would get at vulnerability. You could also see maybe it's exposure plus sensitivity divided by adaptive capacity. Or actually the one that I tend to use a lot is it's exposure times some function of sensitivity and adaptive capacity, because it's really hard often to separate out sensitivity and adaptive capacity. So I like to just lump them all into the same bucket and treat them the same and recognize that they impact vulnerability in similar ways. So I want to give a few examples of kind of this framework and then open it up to conversation. The first one is, as Terry mentioned, I was a part of the state climate assessment that came out in 2017. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, first off, it's got a great website. It's montanaclimate.org, so you can check it out there. But as part of that project, we had we started that project off doing a big, year-long stakeholder engagement where we asked the question, what do you care the most about in terms of different topics to cover in this assessment? And what we got back was forestry, agriculture, and water resources. So that's what the climate assessment focused on. And then of course it was published, and then we heard everybody talking about what we didn't cover, stuff like tourism and recreation, fish and wildlife, human health, and those sorts of things. So we're now trying to kind of supplement what's missing from that original. And the first addendum to that was one on human health, and that came out in 2021. So that's a picture of this report that came out. In that report, there is a heat vulnerability assessment that I'll show you the results. Here's a picture of my daughter about 6 years ago as part of a sensitive age group, but high adaptive capacity clearly to heat, because she knows to go to the water and cool off. So a nice example of reducing her vulnerability to heat. So in that analysis, we broke up exposure into two components. The first one was land surface temperature that we got from satellite imagery. We wanted to use land surface temperature because this is the actual temperature that we feel on the ground. So if you're in an urban area, you're going to feel the heat more than the air temperature if you're walking across pavement. So that's why we chose to use land surface temperature. And then we also wanted to understand how that might change into the future. And so we used a data set that projected change in heat index. And so I'm actually originally from Florida. And so this heat index captures, how we actually feel heat, right? And so I can tell you from firsthand experience, 100 degrees in Montana is way better than 90 degrees in Florida with the humidity. And so this sort of captures that combination of heat, of temperature and humidity. And then, like I said, we kind of lump sensitivity and adaptive capacity into one big bucket. So we used mainly stuff from the census. So income levels, types of jobs were kind of our key components in terms of understanding adaptive capacity and sensitivity. And then we used something called a multi-criteria decision analysis. This was our equation that we used, but it looks complicated. It's really pretty simple. You just stack layers on top of them, and these exposure and sensitivity and adaptive capacity layers, and then you weight them all differently depending on how much they contribute to vulnerability, and you get an output. And this is what that output looked like for that particular report. So this is, again, vulnerability to heat. Both and understanding that it's both a combination of kind of existing temperature as well as projected changes in temperature. And so you can see there's kind of some interesting spatial trends here. We lumped them into these different categories. And this can help us sort of understand where we might want to focus some of our efforts, especially in terms of building adaptive capacity. And then the next example I want to give is the one that I'm working on right now with Valerie and Sarah. So they'll be a part of this conversation as well and can contribute here. So this is like hot off the press. I don't even think they've seen it yet. This is our exposure calculations for drought. And what I did is I broke exposure up into two components of drought. Here in orange, this is the frequency of drought by county that has occurred over the last 20 years. And then here, this is the rate of change of drought by counties. So again, getting at that combination of what area is been historically most exposed to drought, and then are there any trends in positive or negative directions that may give us an idea where we're heading. So kind of some interesting spatial trends here. I think I'm still digesting it myself, but you can see particularly in the northeast corner, historically has not been that droughty, but it really stands out as having a positive drought trend over the last 20 years. So this is something that I think will be interesting to talk about in our drought plan. And is this a real shift that we're seeing, and are there ways that we can accommodate for this? So then in terms of sensitivity and adaptive capacity, for the drought plan, we've hired a group, JG Research, who's led this. They're a group of social scientists, because you really shouldn't have a physical scientist like myself trying to quantify sensitivity and adaptive capacity. I'm much better on the exposure side of things. So I was really happy to see these guys join the team, and they've done a phenomenal job. And so what they've done is they've broken up these two components into quantitative and qualitative data. Qualitative data comes from interviews, and quantitative data comes from data sources. They've standardized the scores, and then they've done this for 3 different sectors. I'm only showing agriculture right here, but they also have it for energy and industry, as well as recreation and tourism. So I'm going to stop there because I don't want to talk too much. I want to open it up to conversation. But I think, one thing to immediately perhaps discuss is, how do you feel about these definitions? I mean, we agreed it's an open conversation. How do we define vulnerability? How do we quantify it? What makes the most sense, especially here in Montana? I think those are all really interesting questions to lead this off. So I will leave it there for now, but thank you all very much, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks for that, Nick. That was great. A lot of information in a short amount of time. I think at this point, everybody hopefully has gotten a good look at your contact information, and we can share that out too afterward. If you want to stop sharing your screen, you can see everybody's faces again here. So yeah, as we mentioned, and Nick said, this is a really good group of people for talking about this topic. We have a lot of expertise and a lot of experience in the room, and so yeah, I'll just open up for questions. But just a reminder, you can certainly address questions to Nick, but also consider addressing them to the group, addressing them to one another, and putting out your own ideas as well. I can start us off too. I am kind of curious. I mean, it's sort of the story of Montana a little bit, but when you're those new maps that you're just digesting, the northeast corner of the state looks like it's getting drier and more drought prone. And of course we know that that's an area of the state that has sort of the fewest resources and the fewest people. What are the plans for using that data going forward? Like how you that seems like it's always the case, right? Like the areas that are most vulnerable or that have the most going on in terms of climate change are often also the most vulnerable. Any thoughts on how that is going to be used at this point?
Well, I think one of the things that I think is really nice about when you have some kind of a definition or framework for dealing with something like vulnerability is you can also break it up into those different components. You can aggregate up to get to locate, sort of where we're most vulnerable here in the state. But then you can also break it down and you can start to look at why are we vulnerable? Are we vulnerable because we have high sensitivity? Are we vulnerable because we have low adaptive capacity? I think when you identify specifically areas of low adaptive capacity, those are things that we can target, right, with strategies. Adaptive capacity tends to be something that we can manage. Sensitivity a little bit so, but sometimes less so. So, my hope, and Valerie and Sarah and I have discussed this, is that we don't end with just saying, okay, here's a map of where we're screwed. It goes into some management strategies and ideas on how we might be able to cope with some of this. And I think by having this framework, it allows us to sort of play around with these different components to better understand how we can have the most change.
And one quick thing I forgot, we did have a couple people, I think Andrea and M. Schaffer joined us a little bit late. I didn't know if the two of them wanted to introduce themselves as well. Or not.
Hi, I can jump in really fast. This is Andrea Silverman. I am based here in Helena, Montana, and I am with Farmers Conservation Alliance. Great to be here.
Thanks.
Andrea, it's nice to see you. I used to work for Farmers Conservation Alliance, and we share the same last name, so we have lots in common.
Exactly. Yes, I heard a bunch about you, and everyone asked if we were related or married. I was like, no, I've never actually even met Nick before, so I'm glad we're starting to close the circle up a little.
Hi, this is Constanza von der Pallen with the Flathead Lakers. Sorry, it's snowing hard and got slowed down. So I'm sorry to have missed your presentation, Nick.
No problem.
And this is Mark. I was looking for the mute button, but I am a hydrologist. I live in Anaconda and work for Pioneer Technical. I just saw this come across my Instagram and thought it sounded fascinating, so I hopped on, and it is interesting. So thank you.
Great. And then the last thing I want to, people feel free to unmute and just ask questions, but also if you're more comfortable, you can put them in the chat and I can field those.
mean, I'm curious if other people have experience with other frameworks for defining vulnerability or disagreements maybe with anything, you know, with the way that we're defining it, or, you know, ideas on maybe ways to improve it, or I don't know, those sorts of things. I think that's where this topic can be particularly interesting, because there's not right or wrong here. It's really about trying to kind of understand and think about things specifically, also from a Montana perspective, which is where I think, you know, we're all really focused right now.
I feel like there's a lot of like one issue things like this. You know, we've identified vulnerability like for TU, like stream flow and things like that. I think it's really appealing to have these things kind of stacked together. You don't see that as often.
Yeah, one thing I think when you look at those maps of vulnerability or sensitivity and you start to rank them, I mean, what we're really doing, because we're having to sort of make up a way to quantify vulnerability, and we need to have some way to measure it, is we tend to measure it relative to, in this case, all the counties, right? So it's which counties are more vulnerable relative to other counties. But in the context of, you know, if we open this up to the United States, Montana may not show up as vulnerable at all, right? So this is sort of a very internal way to look at vulnerability. Like here, as Montanans, you know, where are we most vulnerable? But it may not have any relevance the way that we've sort of defined it to other areas of the country, or comparing it outside of Montana.
Nick, I have a question. So when I look at this stuff, you know, I think about biological types of perspective, as well as I see a lot of this as socioeconomic. I'm just wondering, and maybe this is part of the report, but does this take into account, I'm just thinking like Eastern Montana, there's so much private land, and land management is such a big deal. Does the resiliency part, and maybe vulnerability as well, play into or does it consider ranchers, agriculture, the way people manage their land, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so that was part of the work that JG Research did, is they did a bunch of interviews with people all over the state from different regions and different sectors. Ag was a big one, including ranching and farming, obviously. And a lot of that sensitivity and adaptive capacity comes from those interviews. And I think, you know, one of the things I think Valerie and Sarah have done really well with sort of conceptualizing this is, we realize as like for a state drought plan, we want to both understand it from a state level. What can the state do when we're in drought? But I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity at a landowner level as well. You know, what can landowners do individually to increase their adaptive capacity and increase their resiliency to drought? So I think there's going to be two components to this. One is sort of more a policy component, and then one is more, you know, kind of the individual landowner. But I don't know if Sarah and Valerie, if you want to add anything to that. I'm putting you on the spot. You don't have to. Maybe I answered it perfectly.
That's perfect. I like that question. I think what you're getting at, Nick, is right. And I guess I just want to mention that in an answer to kind of another question about how are we going to be using these maps moving forward, the thought at this point to kind of continue our drought planning process for the state that's been going on the last couple of years is to engage these regional stakeholder groups that we've assembled that are affiliated with each of Montana's 7 climate regions, And we have an online meeting this December, and I can share the link if folks are interested. I know some folks on here are already signed up for that, but the idea will be to kind of foster discussions by region of these regional stakeholder groups to kind of talk about what adaptation strategies are you working on, what do you need support for, and then really roll those up into recommendations in the state drought plan. So we'll have sort of state level recommendations about what agencies and other folks can do, but then also like think about how to better support individual strategies that landowners might be working on. So I'll drop the link in the chat if folks are interested in attending that meeting and kind of seeing more about the state drought plan vulnerability assessment.
Nick, I would just be curious to hear, you use the example of heat as one of the exposure pieces that you looked at. What were some of the other exposure risks that you were evaluating?
Well, for that report, that was the climate change and human health report. I think the only one that got into the report was heat. We also looked at wildfire. The thing with wildfire is like smoke, right? Is like the big issue there. And remember, this is human health. That was the focus there. So you can imagine these things also have different impacts on different species, and and that we didn't get into that. But the challenge, of course, with like smoke is it could come from anywhere, right? Like we get it from BC, we get it from California. So it was a little trickier to try to understand like the exposure or changes in exposure to smoke. It's more or less like it's really driven by like socioeconomics, those sorts. So it was less kind of interesting, I would think, or I think we decided, so we left it out. So it was really just for that report, really focused on heat vulnerability. We also did another one. Christine, are you still in Missoula? Yeah, we did another one as part of the Missoula climate adaptation, Climate Ready Missoula. We did a vulnerability assessment there. It was a little different. It was mainly, we had a lot of like stakeholder meetings, and we had people sort of define things on as a group. It was a little bit less sort of quantitative as these are, and more qualitative. And so in that case, we broke it down to a lot of different sort of categories, and that's on I think it's like climatereadymissoula.org is the website there, and they have vulnerability broken up into lots of different ways.
Yeah, a topic that came up at a conference that I was attending a few weeks ago is, I guess, the question of how well we can predict rain on snow events in Montana, recognizing that was largely what initiated all of the flooding in the Yellowstone. It's definitely an exposure that maybe we don't fully understand our communities to have in terms of a flooding or loss of snowpack or whatever it might be. I'm curious if from your background in all of this, how well we understand how that's going to be changing in Montana.
Yeah, that's a really tricky one, right? Because it's like a combination of events. Even like snowpack, I always think like, so even if you get like, let's take out rain on snow events, and just say, what's our snowpack gonna do? And, I think immediately we think, okay, well, increasing temperatures, we're gonna lose snowpack. But we also see, at least if you look at the models, a likelihood of increased winter precipitation. And because Montana is still cold in the winter, even if it's not as cold as it used to be, it just has to be below 32 degrees Fahrenheit to get snow. So then the question is this, it's like this tug of war, right? Like, who's going to win? Is it going to be the increasing temperatures or the increasing winter precipitation to control our snowpack? And it's, in the end, it's probably going to change, like just be a really different sort of issue where maybe we have more snowpack up high in the mountains, less snowpack down low, And then you have to get to, well, what does that do with rain on snow events, you know, between being up high, you know, and the distribution of snow changing. Yeah, sounds like a really good like research project to me. But yeah, it's super complicated because then these events are also really probabilistic, like, and they, you know, yeah, it's really challenging. I will say, to answer the snowpack question, if you look at like the models, it seems like at least until mid-century, our overall snowpack stays okay. It doesn't change a whole lot because of that tug of war. I think the distribution of snow will change along the way. And then after the kind of mid-century, that's where the temperature starts to win, really. And we start to really, at least the models are saying, projecting a stronger decrease in overall snowpack.
I'm curious too. I know that, you know, we have some Missoula people, you know, Missoula has a pretty strong climate plan. But I was wondering, you know, we've got some Bozeman people, Flathead, Bitterroot. How many of you all have sort of some kind of drought vulnerability and response plan in your own communities? And how many of you are relying on more of the work that Nick and Sarah and Valerie and people are doing at the state level?
Bozeman has a drought management plan and has had one for a few years. And this year the city commission has adopted permanent drought restrictions on landscape watering. Before we had it seasonally, and we measured the rain and temperature, and we determined the level of restrictions, but now it's just permanent.
I think there's somebody in here from the Bitterroot. I know they did like a climate action plan down there. I thought it was really impressive what they were able to put together with very limited resources.
Yeah. Alex, now I know you're a little newer to the forum, but do you know much about that?
Not enough to speak intelligently on it at all. No, I wish that I could. I've only been here about 6 months. But I'm sure there might be someone else on the call that knows something about it.
I was just bringing it up because I think, you know, it's one thing here in Missoula, we have both, you know, more resources and also probably more political will for something like that behind us. And it was really impressive, you know, to see a group down in the Bitterroot, kind of a you know, a real bottom up approach, and you know, worked really hard to get a climate action plan in place there. And yeah, it was just really, it was impressive.
Alex, looks like you need to crack that plan open.
I do. I'm looking for it right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm embarrassed to say I work in the Bitterroot Valley and I was not aware of that effort. That's like, I'm the TU project manager in the Bitterroot, and I think I'd like vaguely heard of it, so I just pulled it up as well. So thanks, Nick.
Well, they ran out. Apparently, they did not have enough money for the marketing side of things. So.
All right.
Yeah, Nick, do you know who spearheaded that, or who sort of got that?
Yeah, there's like a Bitterroot Climate Action Group that formed down there, and Hillary, I forget her last name. She led that effort along with, yeah, a bunch of basically citizens that were interested in this, and they took, that was one of the cool things I thought of, like our plan up in Montana, or sorry, up in Missoula, is they were able to sort of piggyback, especially because the Bitterroot's just south of us. They were able to kind of piggyback a lot of the work that we did up here, and then kind of just translate it to the Bitterroot. So it was a nice way to sort of find resources and use them and still get it done. Yeah, that's great. There's the website. But the one thing I'm jealous of Bozeman, we haven't done a drought plan here at the city level as far as in Missoula. I think that's something that we need to consider. I think we're overly confident with our alluvial unconfined aquifer that we'll never have to deal with water issues.
Well, we're aware of that based on our 4% annual growth rate. We're going to run out of water to service this development in about 9 years.
Yeah.
And we can't shut the door. We can't, put barriers around the city. We keep annexing county lands for development. So we are worried.
Yeah, I wonder, especially the drought piece feels like something that a lot of communities across Montana might benefit from and even be interested in. I just, wonder if they have the resources or would even know how to start such a thing.
Well, I mean, that's a nice thing about the state drought plan that Valerie and Sarah are working on along with others is I think it's going to have some, a lot of regional, like specific information. So even for communities that maybe don't have the resources to put that together, I think there'll still be some really good information in there. Man, this is like not contentious at all. I thought we'd have like some really heated debates on what is vulnerability, and I don't know.
Well,
Yeah.
I was gonna say, Nick, I'm not starting a debate here, but I do love having the standardized process for looking at all of this stuff and using the census data and the qualitative data. What is important information. I was curious at what level, or is there a plan to start incorporating information about, specific information maybe about water supplies and facilities, things about aquifer characteristics and availability, drawdown, stuff like that. Is there any plan to start pulling in hard data into this kind of analysis?
Well, I think the framework is there to do it, right? Because you can imagine any one of those might fit into one of those buckets, right? Either exposure, sensitivity, or adaptive capacity. So if it's like a reservoir, that might increase your adaptive capacity. So I think the framework is there. I think, yeah. So, I also do think that a lot of that, at least in the drought plan, there is both a qualitative and quantitative component to that part of it. I have to be honest, that's work that the JG Research has sort of led, so I'm not as familiar with what's included in that, but and it's still we're still working on it. So I think if there's good data and available and it's relevant, then we should look for ways to include it.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine.
So by all means, share. Yeah, please share. If you have some ideas.
I don't. I just am trying to imagine standardizing all of that data. Things that we're looking at, things like available storage capacity and reservoirs and all of that hard data, getting it into one format that you can look at it on a state level. It's an apples to apples comparison is probably a huge effort, but it seems like it would be really useful for directing funds, tax funds, and other sort of things into solving some of these problems and seeing what infrastructure might need building up, or where the state could get its best return on investment, for building, I guess, that adaptability into our infrastructure. I got no answers. Data is always a problem. Getting it into a usable format takes longer than anybody wants to take to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think one advantage what we're doing is, because it's like we can kind of be creative with maybe, rather than calculating, let's say, storage availability, maybe there's some interesting kind of indicators or proxies for what might represent that in a way that's accurate. It doesn't have to be the actual quantifiable value, but as long as, again, it's relative, right? So because that's really what we're after here in these, at least in the ones that we're working on, is relative to other counties, which counties have more or less availability or storage, or those sorts of things. And so that's something we have on our side, is we can be a little creative with using data. But I don't know, kind of directly think, it would probably be like a brainstorm to try and figure out if there might be ways to be creative and account for that.
Yeah, I mean, I love what you did here. It's a great first step that, allows, I think, folks to drill down and focus on different regions and start asking those hard questions.
I didn't know if, sorry, again, not to put it on the spot, but I know, Valerie, did you have any, because I know Sarah spoke a little bit, this, like how this is being used.
Well,
I don't know if you had any.
I feel like you were reading my mind, because I was like, should I jump in here? We were actually talking about adding a measurable or quantifiable objective to the drought plan this morning. And the drought plan really isn't the right place to start adding like those quantifiable numbers. But we think a good recommendation in the drought plan would be to start developing really measurable objectives for water conservation and things like that, and knowing what we have, and then knowing how far we want to conserve and things like that. And so that will probably be a target for the next iteration of the state water plan, which will start almost as soon as we finish this, I feel like.
Yeah, and that kind of makes me think of, some of the people who are on this call who are involved in more of the restoration and like the, watershed, riparian restoration ends of things, like how that could factor into their projects. And I don't know if anybody on this call is already thinking about those things, but Constanza, unmuting.
Well, I'm speaking from basically a point of ignorance, because I really have not been involved in the drought planning, but I was curious if, within that context, whether there be a way to associate or do an assessment of some of the wetlands that might provide more of a more important hydrological function in terms of mitigating drought. Anyways, I'll leave it at that, and apologize if it's like totally off.
No, I think that's a good point. And I just think of, a couple of people here were on the watershed tour that we had up in the Blackfeet Nation in September, and they were actively, like, areas that they knew historically were wetlands and were getting drier. They were putting up snow fences, and part of it using willows and using more traditional methods, but specifically, like, let's not just use snow fences for keeping snow off the highways. Let's use fences for trapping snow in places where we might need it, where we might want it to recharge wetlands. So that's sort of one example for that. Also makes me wonder if you're in touch with Steve Carpenato and the Wetland Council. You probably are.
Yeah, I think there's a big conversation. I feel like every time I get together with like the hydro science folks and I start talking about natural storage and kind of my interest in that, it always leads to, like, we need to do some sort of assessment that shows where there's the most potential to enhance natural storage, where it's going to help stream flow, and where it's going to have habitat benefits but not necessarily affect things like stream flow, which is, an ongoing target. No one's done that assessment. It would be a really hard assessment to do effectively. I mean, it's all happening underground and we have limited data to model those kinds of things, but I do think there's a huge interest in it, and people are hungry for that information.
So I don't know, like somewhat related and also related to kind of trying to quantify adaptive capacity and then also wetlands. I did back, I don't know, maybe how long ago? I don't even know how long, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. I was working with the Sage Grouse Initiative, and we did some work trying to map, really looking at like specifically wetland area and riparian areas, and looking at sort of their hydrologic connectivity from how green, and productive the vegetation is over like an extended period of time, with the idea of like, if an area, whether it rains or not, if it's always, brown, then it's probably an area that like is not a great place to invest efforts, because it seems like even in a really wet year, it's not really hydrologically connected. In an area that's always green, even during a drought year, it's also maybe not a great place to increase adaptive capacity, because it seems to be hydrologically connected and functioning and resilient. So we really tried to isolate areas that seem to be showing a lot of sensitivity, right? So like in drought years, they're really drying up, but then in wetter years, they're really green and productive. And that seemed to, sort of give an idea of where we might be able to get like some of our bigger gains and some of those processes that you were talking about, Christine, that like, again, this is like a way to kind of cheat a little bit, because we're not actually measuring, soil moisture, hyporheic zones, or anything like that, but we're using sort of this signal to maybe approximate what might be going on there. And then of course you could always then sort of go out and ground truth what's going on, but we were able to do it for like pretty much the whole Western United States. Actually, that work has never been used to my knowledge, because I left. So if anybody's ever interested in that, I'd be happy to connect you.
Yeah, I would love to see that, Nick. I mean, that is right in line with a lot of the conversations that I've been having with the water forum and the Bitterroot as an example. I think, like I said, people are really hungry for that, and some of the cheater approaches, so that you're not just having to put in thousands of groundwater monitoring wells and do massive modeling exercises around that, I think would be awesome.
Well, yeah, that was how I always pitched it. Is I always got scared. I didn't want people like planning like big restoration activities around like this satellite, monitored kind of approach. But I thought it could sort of reduce the reconnaissance, or if you wanted to do like a more detailed model, you could like find an area that seemed to have a lot of potential, and then you could go out in the field, so it's more like a first approach at trying to understand it, so that it's not so daunting to be like, let's look across an entire watershed and figure out where we should, get the biggest bang for the buck. I think that's where it feels like really unrealistic. So yeah, that was the way I hoped it could be used. So anyways, yeah, Christine, if you want to talk offline after this, I'd be happy to share that with you or get you connected to it.
Yeah. And also if there's I don't know if there was a draft document or anything around that would be possible to share, but I'd be happy to send that out to everybody afterward or put it up on the website. So
yeah,
definitely. Yeah, I would love to just learn a little bit more about that. Thanks.
Yeah, it seems like we need a lot, without lots and tons and millions of dollars, those shortcut cheater things are kind of what we need, So yeah. Well, we're about at the end of our time here. And so I'll just I'm gonna put in the chat, just a plug for next month's conservation conversation is going to be with Britta Olson with the Lower Clark Fork Watershed Group on stream restoration, riparian restoration in the face of reed canary grass, how to get around that and really reestablish woody and whatever the natural vegetation is in that area. And so I'll put the conservation conversations page link in the chat if you want to sign up for that one. And then I guess just if we have, or does anybody have any parting thoughts? Nick, anything you wanted to say before we get going?
No, just, thanks for the opportunity. And I would, reach out. I'd love to be more connected to this group. And then, I think this is a really great group of people that are doing good stuff for water resources in Montana. So yeah, I'd love to stay connected after this as well.
And I'll share everybody's email address. If you don't want me to share your email, let me know. Otherwise, it's kind of a nice way to keep connected at the end of these. So yeah, thanks so much, Nick, for taking the time and joining us. I know we didn't even know each other when I reached out. Valerie and Sarah just said, hey, he'd be a great person to talk. And so yeah, I really appreciate you joining us, and yeah, all the work that went into that.
Yeah, thanks a lot. My pleasure.
Thanks everybody else for being here.
Thank you.